Let Mysteries at Midnight be your destination for detective whodunits and captivating mystery stories. You'll hear classic stories like Sherlock Holmes, Agatha Christie's Poirot, and short tales from H.G. Wells, Charles Dickens, Edgar Allan Poe, and others. I'm Christopher, and I read these classic stories in the soothing style of a bedtime story, so you can listen to them in bed when you drift off to sleep. Search for Mysteries at Midnight on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favourite podcast app, and follow and subscribe so you don't miss out on new episodes.
Yeah, Film Vault.
We are one of the original film podcasts.
That can't be true.
There was like 2 other film podcasts when we began, Brian.
How long have we been doing this show?
You and I first sat down and did a version of the show over 20 years ago.
My God.
2 episodes each week. One,
we review movies, and the first episode, and the second one, different top 5 every week. Movies that made you cry. Worst movie accents. Most disturbing movies. All right, the Film Vault. Check it out.
Wherever you find podcasts.
That's right, the Film Vault, going on 20 plus years.
In 1695, a small rural farming community of southwest Scotland was shaken by strange events at the farmhouse of Ringcroft of Stocking. What began with the shuffling around of livestock soon escalated into unexplained noises, stones being thrown through the air, and voices that no one could trace. Neighbours and ministers all flocked to witness the disturbances, but none could find a cause, and no amount of prayers could bring peace to the household, who lived under siege for almost an entire month, before, as suddenly as it started, the disturbances stopped, leaving nothing but unanswered questions and a pile of smouldering ashes. This is Dark Histories, where the facts are worse than fiction. Hello and welcome to Dark Histories, Season 9, Episode 15. I'm your host, Ben, as always. It's great to be with you today, and we have one of the, I suppose, a bit of an introduction to spooky season, although it's kind of spooky season all year round on Dark Histories, but I figured, the summer's drawing to a close, the nights are coming in, and to be completely frank, after Ed Gein last week, I think I needed a bit of a psychological palate cleanse, so I thought we'd go to an old 17th century ghost story from Scotland for this episode. And it's a good one. We'll jump straight into it. This episode is called Ringcroft of Stocking and the Mackie Poltergeist. The Dumfries and Galloway region lies in the southwesternmost corner of Scotland, full of rocky cliffs, fog-ridden sandy beaches, rolling green hills, dense forest, prehistoric monuments, and ancient monasteries. It's a beautiful stretch of country with deep historical ties to religion, superstition and folklore. Despite the area being one of the last to become involved in the Scottish witch trials, it was the region that clung to the old traditions and beliefs of witches far into the Scottish Enlightenment, when the entire rest of the country was casting such superstitions aside. In fact, throughout the late 17th century and early 18th century, just when new modes of thinking were being adopted right across Scotland, the belief and practical use of witchcraft and superstition actually increased across Dumfries and Galloway, as agricultural issues, domestic spats, and everyday disputes with family and neighbours were all frequently being settled through supernatural means. Ironically, this was in no small part thanks to the zealous ministers who at one time struck down such thinking as nonsense, but who were now promoting it as an evil that only God and the Bible could overcome. This led to a raft of stories in the region of witchcraft, demonic influence, possessed animals, folk charmers, healers, and of course, ghosts. One of the most well-known local tales is that of an Irish piper who had been locked up in the castle dungeons and left to starve. He escaped from his confinement through a subterranean passage, but then found himself lost in the dark, labyrinthine tunnels. There, he succumbed to starvation and has, ever since, roamed the land in ghostly format. Another story, and perhaps the best known in the region, is that of the ghost of Galdenock Tower. The tower, once a castle during the Scottish Civil War, had fallen into disrepair and eventually wound up rebuilt as a farmhouse, where the new farmer learnt that not only did his house come attached to this peculiar history, but also a vengeful ghost of a farmer that had been shot by a soldier who he had taken in for the night. The soldier, concerned that his host might have been loyal to the other side, shot him as he left the morning after his stay, only to be tortured by his spirit, who lived on this newly built farmhouse. This vengeful ghost eventually attempted to burn the farmhouse to the ground. A somewhat familiar, if lesser well-known story took place in 1695, when the farmstead of the Mackie family was reportedly haunted by a poltergeist of some kind that would go on to be witnessed by almost the entire population of the nearby village, and documented by a local priest, who was convinced that something untoward had been happening at the farm. Now known as the Poltergeist of Ringcroft or the Mackie Poltergeist, it's a story with plenty of questions and no answers, and just as before, an awful lot of violence and flames. The winter of 1695, like several years previous, had been one of severe weather, with temperatures routinely dropping well below zero. By February, the frost and snow that lay heavy on the ground had already been present for more than 5 weeks straight, and every day the sky never seemed to ease up at all. In London, reports were circulating of the Thames having frozen over, and whilst the frost fairs were not quite so big as those in the 1680s, the frozen river still saw its share of pop-up pubs appear on the ice, looking to serve the revellers excited to celebrate on the temporary and incredibly precarious ground. Naturally, agriculture had suffered, and rural areas, already struggling, were plunged into a difficult period of poor harvests and impossibly difficult to work ground. Right across the United Kingdom, from the southernmost tip of England to the northernmost outcrop of Scotland, frost painted the ground a silvery white that glistened in the pale sunlight, signalling difficult times ahead. In Scotland, Andrew Mackie, a stonemason and tenant farmer, made his home with his family in the farmhouse built 28 years earlier of Ringcroft of Stocking. This was a farm just outside the village of Auchencairn, a small rural outcrop encompassing little more than a single street winding its way along the southwest coast. Opposite the whitewashed walls of the few houses that lined the main road, cobbled walls marked the boundaries of miles upon miles of fields and farmland. These were only broken by the sands and steel-grey waters of Auchencairn Bay. The cold winter had hit agriculture across the United Kingdom, with farms in Scotland suffering even worse than those in the south, thanks to the colder northern climate. Andrew Mackie still had plenty of livestock to care for, however, and so, despite the weather, he still had plenty of farm work to be getting on with. As it happened, that February his cows had been giving him plenty to do. On several nights, he had to trudge over to the barn to fix their bindings, thanks to their unruly behaviour. He'd even gone as far as to fashion new harnesses using branches from the surrounding willows, but nothing seemed to hold, and every morning he found the leashes broken and the cows loose. Eventually, figuring that the animals must have just had some issue with the barn, he had moved them to the back of the farmhouse. But here, he was once more having to go out late in the evening to see what commotion they were kicking up once again. As he turned round the corner of the farmhouse, he stopped in his tracks. Hanging from the back of the house, alongside an old hay tedder that Mackie used to help dry the cut hay before baling, was one of the cows, pulled up tight on a beam so that its feet barely touched the ground. Panicked, Mackie quickly moved to untangle the animal and thankfully found that once it was back on its feet, it was completely unharmed. It was a strange thing to find, he felt, but it wasn't until later that month that he gave it much more thought. As February drew on, he'd been sleeping one night when he woke to the smell of smoke creeping through the farmhouse. Jumping out of bed, he stumbled into the main room, only to find a wicker basket, half full of peat, sitting in the middle of the floor, burning away quite dramatically, apparently all without anyone having been awake to set the flames on fire. Mackie acted quickly to toss the basket out into the garden, and then, with a grumble, he stumbled his way back to bed, trying to put the unusual situation out of his mind. What with that and the cows, something he felt had it in for him this winter. It was early March, though, when both events came back to him in a new light. Things started seeming more and more off from the early evening of Wednesday the 7th of March, when stones began to repeatedly crack into the windows and ping from the walls. Every time Mackie heard a pop, he went to see what was throwing the stones, but he never seemed to find any offenders. This continued right through till Sunday, by which time his nerves were beginning to fray. Making matters worse whenever he sat down to pray, stones would be thrown directly at him, though, as always, there was never anyone around who could have done the throwing. Every day this continued, the peace and quiet of the farm being heavily broken with the constant sound of stones pinging from the walls of the house. As night fell, and the blanket of darkness smothered the usual sounds of the farmhouse, the cracks only seemed louder and more frequent, keeping Mackie awake for hours. The night before, he had been woken by the screams of his children, who had found a figure looking like a body wrapped in a blanket by the fireplace. Blessing themselves and stealing their courage, one of Mackie's sons crept forward and whipped the blanket off the figure, only to find that it had been nothing but an overturned stool all along, though they would later attest to seeing a young boy around the age of 14, wearing grey clothes and a bonnet, perched by the fire. Whilst this may have wound up as nothing, and a more relaxed household might have laughed the whole thing off, for Mackie, the fear that coursed through him when he heard his child's screams only showed how high-strung the recent events had made him. The next day, after church, Mackie approached the parish minister, Reverend Alexander Telfair, and told him of the disturbances at his farm, explaining that, weirdly, as well as the stones seemingly apparating from nowhere, when he collected them up from the ground, they seemed to weigh less than they should. This, he thought, was a sure sign that something ungodly was at play. The Reverend, of course, agreed and decided that he would visit the farm, and 2 days later he trudged across the open fields to Ringcroft, where he found Mackie and his family in relative peace and quiet. The priest sat down with them and prayed and waited for something to happen. All remained quiet for several hours. Eventually, Telfair called it a day and considered the matter closed, leaving the farm and wishing the family well, to a huge sigh of relief from Mackie. No sooner had the breath left his lips, however, was the Reverend running back to the house, following the screams of one of Mackie's children. Having stopped by the barn to speak to a few locals on his way out, the Reverend had seen a few stones fall nearby, just before the screaming pealed out across the courtyard. Dashing into the house, he was immediately greeted by the pelting of several small stones. Turning as always to prayer, Telfair kept his head low and ignored the stones that struck him repeatedly, until at last his recitations were complete and all fell quiet once more. This time, the presence of the priest seemed to do the trick, and the stones fell quiet along with the house. As the Reverend bid Mackie farewell, the night fell over the farm, bringing an uneasy quiet. Thankfully, things did manage to ease up a good deal following Reverend Telfair's visit. For almost an entire week, Andrew Mackie and his family were left in peace, and not a single stone was heard or felt by anyone. The Reverend was soon being called back to the farm, however, following a second, more violent spate of attacks that began on the 18th of March and continued for 3 full days. This time, the stones had turned to rocks, and the cracks and pings were turning into heavy thuds. Beginning to fear for their safety, Mackie asked Telfair to return, which he did on the 21st, along with 3 other local men, who all agreed to stay the night and investigate. The entire evening was broken up with stones being thrown at the visitors, and the Reverend swore that he was being hit with something that felt like a long staff. Each time he felt the whip of the wood against him, the other men by his side jumped back, the crack being audible to everyone in the room. In one of the bedrooms, he heard the same staff, seemingly removed from the bedside cabinet, spring up on its own and rap against the rest of the furniture in the room, with the sound that he described as if calling for access. Later that night, the Reverend was praying in the same bedroom when he felt a heavy weight pressing down on his arm. Looking down, he saw what he said he perceived as a little white hand and arm from the elbow down. No sooner had he laid eyes on the arm, however, it vanished. Sitting on the outskirts of such a rural village, it didn't take long for news of the strange events occurring at the farmhouse to travel around to the locals. Within days, the Mackie's farm had seen visitors almost daily, and so it continued after the Reverend's strange second visit, with more and more people hoping to experience something out of the ordinary. Thankfully, for those whose excitement overshadowed their fear, whatever was going on at the farmhouse, it was apparently not particularly shy, and over the following 2 or 3 days, several more visitors were struck with stones or hit by the same staff that had apparently rapped on the Reverend, with several running from the house in horror. At the same time, the attacks seemed to be getting more and more violent. Andrew Mackie was sporting a small cut on his forehead from where a stone had struck him during one bout of the throwing. Somewhat more terrifying, however, was the attack that saw something unseen shove Mackie in the shoulder several times before gripping him by his hair and yanking his head left to right before scratching his skin with a feeling that he said was something like nails of fingers. Several visitors also found themselves being slung around the rooms of the farmhouse by their clothes. One of the millers from Auchencairn was so terrified and in such pain during an attack where an invisible hand seemed to grip and pull at his side that he later described feeling like his skin would tear from his bones. At least the visitors had the luxury of leaving, and that night, after finding their way to a fractured rest in their beds, the Mackie family were once more being terrorised by the removal of their bedclothes, which were slung into the air before a now familiar invisible force struck them around their hips and legs. These same attacks continued for several more nights too, as furniture clattered and banged with the sound of the wooden staff as it crashed around the rooms, accompanied by the peal of a whistle that was apparently so clear that it had Mackie's dog lurch to the door, thinking that it was being called to attention. Under what appeared to be a constant battle with something, Andrew Mackie reached breaking point, and reaching out to his landlord, Charles McClellan, the two travelled 10 miles to the nearby village of Bootle, where they met with several ministers and repeated the story of the strange events at Ringcroft. Offering their prayers, two of the ministers, a Reverend Andrew Ewart and Reverend John Murdo, travelled back to the farm and agreed to spend the night, fasting and praying in an effort to cleanse the farmhouse of whatever evil was seemingly torturing the family. As expected, this idea didn't quite go to plan, and the presence of the holy men bent on speaking their prayers only caused more violence and anger in the household, as heavy stones were thrown at the two men, one causing Reverend Ewart a deep gash in his head that bled profusely after tearing his wig clean from his head. Reverend Murdo didn't get away any lighter, and he felt several strokes of the staff, each one leaving a bruise. At one point, whilst everyone was settled down to pray, a fiery clod of peat was tossed into the house, which was, fortunately, scraped up and tossed back outside before it could catch light to anything inside. This new pyromaniacal angle to the attacks was more than a passing interest, and the very next day, the barn was nearly set ablaze after some of the thatched hay in the yard outside spontaneously erupted in flames. This was a new, quite dangerous turn of events, but the Mackies did their best to continue living at the farmhouse, despite all the commotion, not least from the villagers, who were by now queuing up to visit. That night, Andrew Mackie and his wife were shoveling peat into baskets to carry into the house for the fire, when Mrs. Mackie felt a stone on the path by the farmhouse door wobble beneath her foot. Keeping her footing, but puzzled by the loose stone, which she had never noticed before, she settled herself in for the evening with the determination to check out the stone the next day once the sun had risen and the daylight was back on the farm. The next morning, the house remained quiet, so after getting up and seeing to the chores, Mrs. Mackie went out into the garden to take a closer look at the loose stone from the night before. Crouching down, she took the slab in her hands and rocked it back and forth, and then lifted it, dropping it to one side. In the small pit beneath where the stone had lay, she found a small packet of dirty, wet paper. Unrolling the little package, she discovered that someone had buried a collection of small bones, some that appeared to still have flesh attached, and several that were stained with blood. Shocked by this sight, and quite afraid, she rolled the slimy bones back into the sodden paper and reburied it beneath the stone, before taking off in the direction of the landlord, McClellan's home, a quarter of a mile up the road. As her figure grew distant on the horizon, the farmhouse erupted into a fury of stone throwing and flame, as rocks pounded into the walls and fiery peats were launched towards the house. The Mackie children, now left alone, asleep in their beds, were shaken awake by this barrage and forced to take action after a burning rock, red hot to the touch, landed in the eldest son's bed, where it slowly began to burn its way through the bedclothes and mattress, forcing him to jump up and drag the whole thing out into the garden before it caught light and burnt the whole house down. Mrs. Mackie returned, along with McClellan, just as her son was heaving the bedclothes into the courtyard. After explaining what he was doing, dragging half of his bedroom furniture outside, to his mother, McClellan rooted through the bed covers and grabbed hold of the stone before dropping it on the ground, finding it still too hot to touch. Turning their attention back to the bones, McClellan uncovered them and carried them off the farm to hand over to the Reverend Telfair, who, upon seeing the macabre little packet, visited the farm at once to offer his prayers. The rest of that afternoon he spent in deep prayer, being peppered with stones, but by evening the house had once more fallen quiet, and when he was sure that these disturbances were over, he left the Mackies to a good night's rest. The sleep was, as ever, a fairly uneasy one for Andrew Mackie, however. The next day was a Sunday, and ever since the issues had begun, Sundays had been the most violent and disruptive. As it was, so it followed, and the next day, William McMinn, a blacksmith from the local village, was hit square in the head by the sharp metal sock of a plough that had been flung through the air. Later that afternoon, the farmhouse saw several attempts at being set on fire, all of which were only extinguished thanks to the high number of visitors that had become a regular feature on the farm, who were able to put the fires out before they could get started. By the end of the day, Andrew Mackie was happy to see the back of another chaotic Sunday. Things took another ugly turn the next morning, however, when Mackie woke up and went downstairs, where he found a folded piece of paper on the kitchen table. On the back, scrawled in a red substance that looked suspiciously like blood, he found the message, "3 years thou shalt have to repent and net it well." Unfolding this paper, he found more of the scratched red writing inside. "Woe be to thee, Scotland, repent and take warning, for the doors of heaven are already barred against thee. I am sent for a warning to thee, to flee to God, yet trouble shall have this man be for 20 days. Repent, 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 Scotland, or else thou shalt." Concerned that this note was somehow alluding to a previous secret tragedy that had occurred at the farmhouse, McClellan, along with the Reverend Telfair, convinced the local magistrate to summon everyone who had previously lived on the farm. One by one, the old tenants filed into the village hall, where they were asked to touch the small packet of bones uncovered from beneath the loose stone at Ringcroft, in order to see if the remains would react in any way. At this time, it was believed in some folk circles that the remains of a murder victim would bleed or bruise at the touch of the murderer. This, of course, would uncover the guilty party, but unfortunately, if the Ringcroft bones held any secrets, they were unable or unwilling to confess, and the old tenants were dismissed. At something of a loss as to where to look next, 5 ministers from around the nearby town of Kirkcudbright were summoned to the farm, where they met with the Reverend Telfair, where they agreed to stay at Ringcroft and carry out a fast and prayer for as long as it was necessary for the unnatural events to cease. Things moved fairly quickly, and so, by Wednesday, the 6 priests were all trudging their way up to the farmhouse, where they settled in for a long day of disturbed prayer. Things, of course, didn't take long to take off, and as soon as the Reverend Telfair opened his mouth, stones were thrown at him from all angles. Continuing his chants without a hitch, the stones began to crash into the house around them, some with such force that the walls shook and dust fell from the rafters. The thatched roof creaked and cracked above them, and then, with an almighty shattering and a tremor that shook the ground, the roof collapsed in one corner, as stones crashed through atop the priests. One rock, which Telfair estimated at weighing 1/4 pound, struck a priest named James Monty on the back, but they all ploughed on regardless. More rocks were hurled, some described as being bigger than a fist. Outside, the barn doors, until now strongly kept in its frame, were ripped from its hinges and tossed to the ground. As the men continued their prayers, unseen hands grabbed the men's legs, pulling at their feet and tripping them to the ground. This chaotic ritual continued for almost a full 6 hours, until finally, at 10 p.m, the house fell silent. Satisfied with their work for the day, the priests left, but as always, the calm never seemed to last. And once the ministers had ended their prayers, things soon slipped back into violence and commotion. For 3 days straight, the Mackie farmhouse was bombarded with rocks from dawn until dark. Visitors to the house all reported feeling the strikes of a cane, and one, a chapman named Samuel Thompson, was beaten by a dead ferret that his dog had caught on his way to the house. Upon his arrival, he had thrown the dead animal by the front door, and as far as he could tell, no one had brought it inside, Yet there it was, flying through the air, and smacked him around the back of the head, lying at his feet. The whole scene was too much for Thompson, who ran into the yard and promptly threw up from the fright. And then Sunday rolled back round again. This time, Mackie was hit with a spade that had been tossed through the air, while stones rattled against the walls long into the evening. With no end to this disturbance in sight, the landlord, McClellan, found himself at the farmhouse for more than he might have liked. For the following week, he returned almost daily, always alongside several other men from the local area. On the 15th of April, he visited with a drover from Auchencairn named William Anderson and Anderson's son-in-law, James Patterson. All three were pelted with stones as they approached the house, and Patterson was struck in the head by a rock so hard that it sent blood trailing down his face. That evening saw another new element to the disturbance, when all three men sat down for prayer, and the house was filled with eerie whistles, groans and cries from a seemingly invisible origin. The twisted sounds echoed through the farmhouse for several days, always kicked off by prayer, and always with occasional outbursts of words like whist whist, bow bow, and kick cuck. As more and more visitors were tripped and thrown in the air by an invisible hand that was apparently gripping their legs, more and more visitors seemed to want to come. Each time, however, it always just ended the same, as brave locals entered the farmhouse full of prayers and humour, only to see them flee in fear shortly after. One group attempted to break this mould, and on the 16th, Andrew Mackie and his family left the farm for a night, leaving it entirely in the care of 5 locals who were keen to investigate the disturbances overnight. Strangely, and perhaps meaningfully, with none of the Mackie family on the premises, the farm sat quiet all night long, for perhaps the first time in several weeks. Upon his return to the farm, Mackie saw that several of the cattle had broken free of their bindings, but nothing else had happened the whole time he'd been away. That night, the Mackie family settled themselves in to stay back on the farm, which once again stood quiet, the peace broken only by a few scrapes and scuffles coming from the yard. In the morning, Andrew Mackie woke up and checked round the house, finding that everything just as it had been the night before. Sleepily, he made his way outside to check on the livestock, where his momentary relief was once more shattered, as he found that his sheep had been tied in pairs by their necks with ropes made of straw that had seemed to have been taken from the sheep house itself. All being said, though, the farmhouse had been relatively calm for almost 48 hours. Unfortunately, it was something like the calm before the storm, and in the week following, the farmhouse saw an ever-escalating barrage of attacks. Everything kicked off again the day following the discovery of the bound sheep. Rocks began pelting into the house once more, this time with such force that the Mackie family began fearing for their lives. For almost 2 full days, the family endured a nerve-wracking display of violence that had them pinned deep inside the house, afraid to move outside or anywhere near the windows. And then, on the 3rd night, breaking from the groans and whistles that had become commonplace, something of a discernible voice scratched its way into the room where the disembodied words told Mackie that it had been sent from God to have everyone in the land repent. This was a direct order, apparently, and if it was not followed, a judgment would come, warning that it would set fire to the house and trouble the family until the following Tuesday. It didn't take long for the voice to come through on its promise, either. The following day, the farmhouse was set alight on 7 different occasions, each time extinguished by Mackie and his children. With a heavy sigh, Andrew Mackie made his way to bed that night, aware that the next day, being Sunday, things were likely only to get worse. He was not awake long the next day before fires began to burn. Rushing back and forth, extinguishing one fire after another, Mackie spent almost all day, non-stop, throwing water on flames, as one patch hissed with a thick black smoke, another burst into orange flame on the other side of the room. When the fires finally ceased and Mackie felt the day might finally be coming to an uneasy conclusion, the far wall of the house was ripped from its foundations, collapsing the stone across the yard and leaving the house almost entirely unlivable. In some disrepair, the family were forced to light a fire in the barn, where they slept the night, afraid for the structural integrity of the rest of their home. That night, when the family lay asleep in their beds, one of Andrew Mackie's sons was dragged from his bedclothes by his shoulders, and after he'd been tossed aside, the invisible force then whipped up a thick log from a fallen tree, hovering it above the children, who were laying terrified in their beds below the precarious weapon. Everyone present, including several of the locals, heard a scratching voice threaten to brain the children before it cast aside the log, and quiet fell across the farmhouse once more. By Monday, Andrew Mackie was clinging on to the hope that the following day things might finally fall quiet, just as the disembodied voice had promised. Perhaps, without this small glimmer on the horizon, the day would have been altogether impossible to navigate. As the farmhouse stood in what was quickly becoming a ruin, flames began to burst out across all of the rooms, one after another, again and again, until the Reverend Telfair arrived later that evening. When he did come in, his presence seemed to quiet the commotion, allowing the Mackies a small period of respite until he left at 4 a.m. that morning. Finally, as the farmhouse stirred awake on Tuesday morning, the day of reckoning had arrived. Andrew Mackie went downstairs with an apprehension in his step and a heavy foreboding in his chest. The following day, he had poured water over so much of the house, including the hearth, that now it was still difficult to burn a fire in the cold, frosty morning. Despite the discomfort, the day did manage to pass, almost entirely without event, and later in the afternoon, several locals made their way up to the farmhouse where they sat with the Mackies in the barn, praying for whatever conclusion was in store. During their prayers, the landlord, McClellan, said he saw what he described as a black thing in the far corner of the barn. It had no discernible shape, he said, nor a figure, but rather it crept like a thick black cloud. This description was enough for several of the locals, who saw themselves quickly back to the village. Those that did stay behind were later attacked with mud thrown at their faces, whilst invisible hands gripped them and tore at their skin with what was described as sharp nails. And then, finally, the house fell quiet for what Andrew Mackie prayed would be the last time. Unfortunately, whatever warning he had heard, whatever promise that any disturbance would only last until Tuesday, was seemingly running slightly behind by their own calendar. The next day, the entire barn housing the sheep was burnt to the ground, leaving the farmhouse broken and crumbling, and perched next to a skeletal black structure of smoke and ash. This was, however, the last trouble the farmhouse ever encountered. No one ever found an answer as to why the disturbance stopped so abruptly, nor how they had begun in the first place. The farmhouse had been the centre of rumours in the past. Andrew Mackie himself had been the centre of some of these rumours, and there were several who traded whispers that he had sold his first child to the devil during his enlistment into the Masons, though this was disproved by the Reverend Telfair, who appeared to ask him directly about these rumours himself. Andrew Mackie, he said, was moral, honest, civil and harmless beyond many of his neighbours, and throughout the disturbances he said that he had always turned to prayer, which of course was much to the satisfaction of the priest. Other rumours suggested that some clothing left behind at the farmhouse from a previous tenant who had since passed had been kept by the Mackie family, leading the spirit of the deceased to attack the house. Once again, however, the priest Telfair addressed this rumour directly, and Mackie denied stealing any of the clothes, stating that he had found some clothes in a sack, but that he had handed them over to the dead woman's friends. One final rumour surfaced thanks to a previous tenant and their relation to the priest Telfair. Prior to the Mackie family coming onto the farm, the place had been rented by Thomas Telfair, who was said to have discovered that the tenant before him, who had already died, had sent his son to a local witch healer in order to inquire why both he and the farm seemed to be dealing with sickness, as both his physical health was suffering and the harvests of the farm were failing. The old witch had apparently told the son to search the farm for a tooth, which, should they happen to find, they should then burn. Unfortunately, the man's son had decided not to return to the farm at all, and instead he joined the army abroad to fight in the war on the continent. By the time that he did return, his father had died and his family had left the farm entirely. So instead, the young lad passed the information that he had received from the witch on to Thomas Telfair, who searched the farm and did, it so happened, find a tooth right where the man said it would be. Though he could not tell if this was animal or human, and he himself had never really had any trouble at the farm. Still, he did as the witch had instructed and burnt it all the same, just to be sure. Despite this conclusion, some believed the tooth to still be casting some kind of curse on the farm, but the Reverend Telfair was quite certain that they were entirely unsubstantiated. With such a poor local reputation, the farmhouse at Ringcroft soon fell into disuse and disrepair, until eventually it was demolished completely, the only remnant of the property a single solitary tree that still stands today, silhouetted on the hill where the farm once stood. The Dumfries and Galloway region of Scotland is a region with no shortage of stories of the strange and unusual. But even so, the story of the Mackie family poltergeist still remains as one of the most infamous to come from the area, and still lives strong, even though the farmhouse has long since been forgotten. So that was the story of the Mackie Poltergeist and the Ringcroft of Stocking farm. And we'll talk a little bit about that after these short advert breaks.
Did you know ancient Romans used to brush their teeth with urine?
Or that there's a medieval recipe for exploding soup?
Or that in the 19th century London, people held seances to talk to ghosts inside their plumbing?
That's the kind of weird crap you might hear on the Box of Oddities podcast.
But now we're hitting the road to do live shows.
Nobody asked us to, but we're doing it anyway.
We're Kat and Jethro.
Join us for an unforgettable evening of strange stories, twisted trivia, and deeply unnecessary research.
The Box of Oddities. It's Alive 2025 Fall Tour.
It's like history gets drunk and tells you its secrets.
We're coming to Seattle,
Portland,
OKC,
Atlanta,
Philadelphia,
Appleton, Wisconsin,
Louisville, Kentucky,
and Chicago, Illinois Halloween night.
Get your tickets at theboxofoddities.com.
Again, that's theboxofoddities.com.
Because if history can repeat itself, so can we.
That's theboxofoddities.com.
All right, that's enough.
Did archaeologists discover Noah's Ark?
Is the rapture coming as soon as the Euphrates River dries up?
Does the Bible condemn abortion?
Don't you wish you had a trustworthy academic resource to help make sense of all of this?
Well, I'm Dan Beecher, and he's award-winning Bible scholar and TikTok sensation Dr. Dan McClellan, and we want to invite you to the Data Over Dogma podcast,
where our mission is to increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion, and also to combat the spread of misinformation about the same.
but, you know, in a fun way.
Every week we tackle fascinating topics. We go back to source materials in their original languages.
And we interview top scholars in the field.
So whether you're a devout believer,
or you're just interested in a clear-eyed, deeply informed look at one of the most influential books of all time,
we think you're going to love the Data Over Dogma podcast.
Wherever you subscribe to awesome shows.
Hello, listeners. This is Ann Bogle, author, blogger, and creator of the podcast, What Should I Read Next? Since 2016, I've been helping readers bring more joy and delight into their reading lives. Every week, I tackle all things books and reading with a guest and guide them in discovering their next read. They share 3 books they love, 1 book they don't, and what they've been reading lately. And I recommend 3 titles they may enjoy reading next. Guests have said our conversations are like therapy, troubleshooting issues that have plagued their reading lives for years, and possibly the rest of their lives as well. And of course, recommending books that meet the moment, whether they are looking for deep introspection to spur or encourage a life change, or a frothy page-turner to help them escape the stresses of work, school, everything. You'll learn something about yourself as a reader, and you'll definitely walk away confident to choose your next read with a whole list of new books and authors to try. So join us each Tuesday for What Should I Read Next? Subscribe now wherever you're listening to this podcast, and visit our website, whatshouldireadnextpodcast.com, to find out more.
Welcome back. So yeah, great story. I think, well, we'll talk how much of it is a story in a moment and how much of it is true. But I think probably the first thing that I always like to address when I look at these stories like such as this, these kind of 17th century, sort of 16th to 19th century stories, I think it's always telling to look at who documented them and who wrote them down and published them. Nearly almost every single case will be a priest or a minister or of some kind would have written it down. And it's almost always, when you look at it from a sort of societal perspective, it's almost always in retaliation to the Enlightenment, right? it's like they double down on the threats against, or what they perceive to be threats against their religion, and they sort of, like I say, double down on these kind of supernatural ideas. And unsurprisingly, this is the way with this story. The story is well documented. It has a pamphlet that was published at the time, written, of course, by the Reverend Telfair, and he gives basically a blow-by-blow account, sort of almost day-by-day account taken from Andrew Mackie himself. So, that's great. You've got this kind of first-hand witnesses. He gives the names of everyone that witnessed it, and there's a whole bunch from about just over a dozen of the sort of locals that were in, you would say, good positions in the local community, and they all apparently witnessed it, and they all gave their name to it. But of course, like I say, it's important to see who wrote it, and say unsurprisingly, it was a priest that wrote this, and again, unsurprisingly, he manages to shoehorn in a strong moral message about repenting or suffering punishment. I think that tells you a lot more than the rest of the story, really. But whether or not he inserted that into the story, the idea of repenting or punishment, whether he put that into the story or he designed the story for that very message is a different debate entirely. And I do think it's one worth having to some degree, because, and I'll tell you for why, because the blow-by-blow account is quite raw and visceral and quite good. I think it's a bit difficult to read because the language of the time there's a lot of slang and stuff. You have to do a lot of deciphering, but once you get through it, it's an interesting read, right? But the thing that stuck out to me is when the quote-unquote poltergeist or ghost was giving this message of repent and stuff, the writing, I feel it changes quite distinctly, and it's clearly not real. It's clearly a false message. I think to be more believable now, I think it would have been better if Telfair had written it and said, look, I don't have the exact quotes, but this is kind of me giving the gist. I think that would have made it feel better, but he doesn't. He just says this is exactly what it says, and then he scripts off this kind of nonsense conversation between Andrew Mackie and this ghost, and it's completely fake. It's clearly not true, right? But I think it's interesting that it's completely different to the rest of the story. It really feels shoehorned in. It really feels completely out of it. And so that's why I say, did he have this story and decide to shoehorn a moral element into it to sort of use the story for his own good? Or did he have the moral element and he just wanted to write the story? So, the entire story is fake and made up as a vehicle for this moral message. I think they're your two kind of sides that you can sort of sit on in this story. Do you believe it was a ghost and that he sort of shoehorned this in, or do you believe that it was all made up just for that? Personally, I don't know. For me, there's not enough evidence, but I do think it's really interesting, and I do think it's there's a lot of strange things happening that I don't think it's as straightforward as everyone making something up. I think possibly someone was just having them on, for example, the bones found in the wrap. Sadly, it doesn't give you a great description of what these bones look like, but it mentions that they're small. It makes me wonder if they were not like chicken bones or something like that. That's a bit of a shame to say that they're not sort of written about in more detail. But yeah, I from that I get the feeling that either it was someone having them on and playing a sort of quote unquote prank, or it was actually a sort of superstitious, witchcrafty type thing that was happening. I read a couple of really interesting academic papers about this region of Scotland and how it kind of clung on to the superstitions and ideas of the supernatural and witchcraft and stuff much longer than everyone else. And it was a fascinating read. But it reminded me of Ireland a little bit, how that they sort of clung on to these kind of folk healers and stuff for a really long time. It reminded me of that. And it did make me wonder if, maybe this was a story of some kind of witchcraft or something, some kind of local witchcraft that was happening. But I think it's actually quite an open end. Like I say, it's given as a ghost story and it's talked about like it was poltergeists, but I do think there's certainly an element that could be much more human than that. And I think, you could probably explain it all with quite rational things, but rational things that were trying to sort of utilize supernatural ideas. So, the chicken bones were just someone wrapping up chicken bones, putting them there. When you find them, it looks ominous and quite scary, but actually it's just someone trying to do some, witchcraft. All of the rocks could easily just been someone harassing them. No one was ever found, and there was a lot of people that stayed at this house. But who knows? In a small village, you wonder. You can't get away with much in a small village. If someone was doing that, someone would have known. But who knows? I, as ever, don't offer any answers. One small thing that I did find quite interesting was that the priest Telfair, Alexander Telfair, he was quite an interesting guy. And it seems that, later on his family went to America and became quite a big merchant family in Georgia, which I thought was quite interesting. Other than that, I don't think there's a lot more to say. I think one of the things that frustrated me about this case, actually, I wasn't able to find out how many children Andrew Mackie had, which is the sort of thing that I always like to find out when I do these episodes, even if I don't really write it in, to the script. I always find it really important to get a family tree of the main characters sort of sketched out for myself. And I couldn't find it for this one. I think I could say with some confidence that he had 3 children and they're all boys, but I wouldn't like to sort of 100% it, which is why I didn't really put it in the script, but I'm fairly sure that quite frustrated me. But on that note, one thing I did find out and worth noting is that every name that the priest wrote into the book did exist. They were real people. And that I thought is interesting element of the story. But anyway, I'll leave it there for now. And you're welcome to come up with any theories of your own. Say I'm all over the place on this one. So yeah, if you have any theories or whatever and you want to let me know, you can do so. You can email me at contact@darkhistories.com. You can also message me on any social media. All the links to that are in the show notes. You can also go to darkhistories.com and find ways to email and contact me there, as well as you can find all ways that you can support the show if you would like to. Patreon, things like that. We've got ad-free episodes on Patreon, got merchandise. Even if you could just, find a few minutes to leave a review, that's really helpful for me. I do almost no promotion for the show. So, all of the growth that's happened on Dark Histories is entirely down to you. And obviously I'm incredibly thankful for that because I'm useless at that stuff. But anyway, enough of my waffling. Thank you very much for listening this week. I will be back in 2 weeks with another full episode, but I'll be back next week with Yesterday Today. Until then, thanks again for listening. As always, it's been just a wonderful pleasure. I'll be back very soon. So yeah, until then, take care. Sleep tight.
Have you ever wondered who the Mary was from Bloody Mary? If the Loch Ness Monster was real, or if Ouija boards actually worked? On each episode of the family-friendly Unspookable, we look at the histories and mysteries behind your favorite scary stories, myths, and urban legends to get the real stories behind the scares. Want to solve your next mystery? Find and follow Unspookable now wherever you get your podcasts.